Today we're reviewing our Celestians and our Dominions, our Repentia and our Paragons, with a look at every single Sisters of Battle unit from the latest Adepta Sororitas Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're doing another one of our big unit reviews of strengths and weaknesses for every single datasheet within a codex. Today we're going to be focusing on the Sisters of Battle, who have had their army roster expanded really quite a bit in the latest decks, so now people have had a fair few months to experiment with the army. I thought it would be fun to look over the units again, and just share a few rough ideas as to whether or not I think a unit's good or bad, what are the positive points and what are the weaknesses, and a very rough score out of 10 for how strong they are, just for how I personally rate the unit at the moment. Overall, the Sisters are certainly holding their own in 40k right now. They're one of the stronger armies in the game, and I'd say that largely they've done quite a good job with the codex. Really quite a lot of the datasheets are interesting and usable, and there aren't all that many duds. In any case, let's take a look through. We'll start with the troops, then we'll go through the different force organisation slots in turn, and talk about every unit in the codex. So first up, I thought we'd start with the basic Battle Sister squad, 11 points per model. You can get them in squads of 5, and they're really quite a nice flexible troops choice, maybe best used as very cheap objective secured units for doing things like objectives, actions and screening, but you can most certainly gear them up for a bit of damage dealing as well. Say for example give them things like multi-melters in the Argent Shroud. You potentially can make some seriously hefty units of Sisters, where you maybe go all in on the bolters and the special weapons, and you try and put various buffs on them. You can certainly make them a lot tankier and have some fairly scary damage output with things like war hymns and character buffs, but I'd argue that for the most part it seems like it's better to do that on other more dedicated damage dealing units. I'd say that for the role of damage dealers in 9th edition, individual Sisters just aren't really all that hot compared with the other choices, which is why people often tend to run them in small units just to do the grunt work of the army and letting the elites do the fancy damage dealing. Otherwise they're not really all that strong in melee either, only hitting on 4s and strength 3. Another thing that can potentially be an issue if you are trying to use them to carry the battle line as opposed to just screen. Still though, for the role that they hold, I think they're absolutely great. It's nice to have some really cheap troops, they can be pretty handy to have on the board, and I've scored them a 9 out of 10. Next up we have the new Sisters Novitiate, the ones that came out in that Kill Team Chalnath box. They've got a new datasheet to download on the Warhammer community page, and they're usually around 75 to 85 points for a 10 Sister squad in 4+ armor saves. Per squad they're a little bit more expensive than basic Battle Sisters, but per model they're quite a lot cheaper. They do seem like a potentially interesting throwaway squad to hold the centre of the table, maybe soaking up a fair bit more damage than they really should, and having the potential to put out a surprising amount of melee damage. Bloody Rose could get them hitting with 40 attacks with strength 4 and AP -1. They have very cheap access to re-rolling advance and charge rolls with their banner, and they can make some pretty good use of the HQ synergies being a core unit. As for weaknesses, their inflexible squad size doesn't help them too much. If they could be taken in very small units, they might well outcompete Battle Sisters for small unit objective things. I'm not really the biggest fan of their range damage output in those auto guns. I think they're a bit on the weak side. You can't take all that many squads of them, as their numbers are limited per numbers of Battle Sister squads already in the army, and they only have a 4+ save and 4+ weapon skill, which does hold them back a bit. Still though, I think their melee damage is pretty impressive for the amounts of points that they cost, which isn't many. They can make good use of synergies. I wouldn't be surprised to see a squad or two of these hitting the table in Sisters lists. Again, I've scored them 9 out of 10. Slightly niche use, and probably best in Bloody Rose, but still quite good. Next up we come to the workhorse for the Sororitas, the trusty Rhino, the 80-point transport choice that we all know and love, a very cheap way of getting A to B, pretty tough with a toughness 7, 10 wounds and a 6+ invul, and a unit that really serves to make other Sororitas units work with a great synergy with certain damage dealers such as Repentia, Retributors or Dominions. All of those hit very hard indeed, but they're going to get gunned down fairly easily if they're directly targeted, so Rhinos allow them to get the first strike on the enemy. Once the transporting is done, it can be a nuisance unit to disrupt and distract the enemy, maybe do nuisance charges or move block, and it doesn't really do all that much damage, but that's not really the point of it. As a cheap durable transport, it's pretty excellent. I'd expect to see plenty of them in competitive Sisters lists, and I've scored it a 9 out of 10. Unfortunately, the same can't really be said of the Immolator, which is perhaps a slightly unhelpful combination of transport and gun platform. It can carry a small squad into battle, though you're not getting as much transport for your points compared with the Rhino, and it does have some fairly flexible loadouts, choosing between flamers, multi-melters or heavy bolters. I'd say the flamers and the multi-melters are the most interesting options. The multi-melter version does hit fairly hard to be fair to it, and the auto-explode stratagem on the Flamer variant is a nice to have. Generally though, I'd just argue that this thing is less efficient compared with taking rhinos for your transporting sisters and using other more efficient firepower choices in the codex, maybe things like retributors if you want the multi-melters. I feel like its dual role kind of divides its priorities. Does it want to be transporting sisters forward, or does it want to be staying safe and not getting tagged by enemy units in melee? And for the cost it isn't really all that durable, particularly if you're equipping it with the expensive multi-melters. Overall I've scored it a 6 out of 10, despite looking really pretty with its stained glass window. I just don't think it's on the same sort of level as the Rhino in terms of a good transport. Moving on next, I thought we'd do the fast attack, starting out with the excellent Dominions, 12 points per model, and if you upgrade to one of the more standard loadouts with maximal Artificer crafted Stormbolters, they're 80 points for a 5-woman squad. If you want to spam special weapons, then they're basically the place to be, and the ones that most people seem to like the most are those Artificer crafted Stormbolters. They put out a flurry of damage 2 shots, but more importantly they have a very cheap mortal wound stratagem that could easily allow you to deal 6 mortal wounds per turn for a single command point. On top of that, if you put them in a Rhino, then the Rhino gets a short pre-game move. That's really quite nice as they can only be part of the transport capacity of the Rhino. They could potentially also have that movement boost to have things like Repentia or Retributors come along for the ride. Maybe in downsides, they do tend to be slightly one-hit wonders because they're fairly fragile once they're out. They won't want to be tagged in melee, and their mortal wound stratagem is certainly a bit swingy. You could easily get the 6 mortal wounds. If you get a bit unlucky, you might get literally none. Still though, I think they're a really efficient little unit for the cost, and I've scored them a 9 out of 10. Moving on, we come to the Seraphim, another cheap fast attack choice, 14 points base, and again they have a loadout that really stands out, a small squad of 5 sisters, packing 2 models with 2 hand flamers each. The reason that loadout seems to be so popular is that they can really put out a very hefty strength 4 deep strike punch when they come down with the Deadly Descent stratagem. Deadly Descent allows you to fire all those pistols twice, so with those strength 4 Ministorum hand flamers, you'll be getting an average of over 30 strength 4 hits on the enemy unit. That could be easily enough to clear out backfield objective holders. In addition to that, they're really quite a good utility unit, quite fast moving for doing actions and taking objectives or getting in table quarters, and they're perhaps a touch sturdier than some of the other sisters, having their better invul save with Angelic Visage. I think perhaps their main downside is that you don't really want to go too heavy on them, as I think that Deadly Descent is really one of the things that makes them most efficient, so maybe you're not going to want more than 2 units of these to come down on turn 2 or turn 3. Otherwise their other special pistols are a bit less appealing, I think, particularly as you can't fire the Inferno pistols out of Deep Strike anymore. Still though, really quite a nice unit. I've scored them a 9 out of 10 for a really powerful anti-infantry punch plus utility. Definitely a solid option to consider. Finally, for our trio of very good fast attack choices, we have the Zephyrim, whose name I appear to have misspelled on the slide, and I can't see why. They're 17 points per model, so 85 points for a small squad of 5, and they put out a pretty decent flurry of damage 1 attacks with decent AP, a big 3 attacks per sister, or 4 in Bloody Rose. They're sort of a different flavour to Repentia, potentially having really quite a long strike range with their good movement, and they do seem like a unit that gets a lot better when you stack layered buffs on them. They can have a stratagem for +1 to wound in combat, just base, but other characters can really make them work too. In particular, they could be a really good choice for Morven Valve's 4 rerolls to hit and wound. Otherwise, they're quite similar to Seraphim in being a nice fast unit for doing actions and completing objectives. Again, they get the better invul save from Angelic Visage, and they can get cheap reroll charges with their Zephyrim Pennant. Again though, like quite a lot of the Elite Sisters, they're still fairly fragile for the points cost, so they are going to want to hide out of line of sight if they can. And unlike, say, Repentia, which are fairly general purpose, these girls only get damage 1 melee attacks, which will hold them back a bit against big, tough, multi-wound things, perhaps things like Gravis Armoured Space Marines with 3 wounds each. Still though, a big flurry of damage 1 attacks certainly isn't anything too bad in the meta at the moment. It's pretty useful against things like Other Sisters, Admech, or maybe Death Guard, and these certainly seem to crop up in competitive lists, particularly Bloody Rose. I've scored them a 9 out of 10. Moving on into the Sisters heavy support now, and we'll start out with the tanks. First up we have the Castigator. It's a heavy support choice for 160 points base, though upgrading to the battle cannon does cost a little bit more, and to be honest it does kind of fit in with heavy support gun tanks across much of 40k. Not particularly terrible in terms of the points cost for the damage output, but just usually being outcompeted by the infantry choices that have core and can get powerful shooting buffs and rerolls. For the Castigator's part, it is longer range than a lot of the Sisters of Battle choices. Generally, Sisters anti-tank tends to come from melter weapons, which are only 24-inch range, and the battle cannon is longer, and it can deliver that firepower with decent movement as well, jumping around the board 12 inches, and having a couple of interesting stratagems such as Smokescreen and Blessed Hull. Compared with other gun platform choices in 40k though, it's just really not all that standout. As I said, it struggles to compete for damage output. If it gets tagged in melee, it's in for a bad time, and it's not really all that tough against dedicated anti-tank firepower either, if it does happen to be exposed to return volleys. Overall, I've scored it a 7 out of 10. I don't think it's particularly bad, but it just maybe doesn't fit in with the Sisters of Battle army playstyle quite as well. Its counterpart, the Exorcist, is in a very similar place in my opinion, 150 to 180 points, depending on whether or not you upgrade to the anti-tank missiles. In general, I do think they're worth it though. For the points, the Exorcist is fairly similar to the Castigator, though when taking account with those extra heavy bolters that the Castigator gets, the Castigator does usually win slightly against most targets in terms of damage output for the points. I'd say the main reason to take the Exorcist over the Castigator is its indirect fire stratagem, which is very pricey at 2 command points, but being able to put the seriously hefty firepower of an Exorcist into the exact unit that you need to kill the most could genuinely be quite game-changing, perhaps finishing off an injured enemy unit or mopping up troops that were going to score an objective and earn the enemy precious victory points. The problem is that you really couldn't be affording to do that too often. 2 command points is a lot, particularly if you're going to do it on multiple turns, and again, certainly Exorcists don't seem to be anywhere near as popular as they used to be back before the new codex. Again, I'd rate them a 7 out of 10. They do okay for what they do, though just maybe aren't as stand out as some of the other Sisters' choices. Moving on, we come to Mortifiers. Really quite brutally efficient engines of redemption, and these really have quite a lot to sell them. They're 60 points per model, have flexible squad sizes, are relatively fast, and at least relatively hard to shift with 5 wounds with feel no pain. Maybe low armor saves and relatively low toughness are a bit of a weakness though I think they're really sturdy in terms of staying power. Basically any type of firepower is at least somewhat effective against them. In any case though, what makes these really interesting is they have very decent damage both in terms of melee and ranged. 6 heavy bolter shots hitting on 3s is no bad thing at all, and it's really quite impressive to see that backed up with quite so much hefty melee damage. Hitting on 3s and Zealot means that almost every single attack's going to hit, and they're likely to stack a fair few saves on whatever they target in combat. On top of that, they both have the option for mortal wounds in death when they're killed in melee, and their final redemption stratagem, meaning that these can be really annoying to put down. As for weaknesses, they're a non-core unit, and they're not going to get any sort of benefits from orders, as they don't count as being from any one order. It means that what you pay for in points is basically what you get. They're not likely to get much tougher or stronger than this when paired with things like characters. Another major flaw is that vehicle rules don't interact all that well with terrain. Not that handy on an assault unit to have things like ruins blocking their movement. That can be one disadvantage compared with infantry. Still though, I think a couple of small units of these are rarely going to be a bad choice in a Sisters list. They're quite nice general purpose units that your opponents are almost always going to need to deal with, and can be decently effective whether or not they actually make it into combat with all that bolter fire. Their rivals for being the best engines of redemption are the Penitent engines, again a heavy supports choice and very similar to the Mortifiers. The major differences being that they're only 55 points, they only hit on 4s, and they're locked to the Ministorum Heavy Flamers as opposed to Heavy Bolters. Their trick is being able to advance and charge, though it is quite an unfortunate one that they won't be able to fire their Heavy Flamers if they do so, and otherwise they are fairly similar. I'd say perhaps the biggest issue with the Penitent engines is being locked to the Ministorum Heavy Flamers. I think they are fine and certainly have hefty punch against close-range infantry if they do get too close, but I feel like just to make the unit a bit more well-rounded, I'd often prefer to have the Heavy Bolters. It just makes them a bit more flexible as opposed to a unit that just really needs to rush at the enemy or it's not going to do anything at all. I've scored them an 8 out of 10, maybe I've been a little bit harsh on them, perhaps they should have been up at the same level as Mortifiers. Finally though, for the heavy support, we come to the excellent Retributors, 60 points base for the squad plus heavy weapons, perhaps most notably 20 points from Multi-Melter and 10 points from Ministorum Heavy Flamer. Basically these goals are the ones to go for if you just want sheer damage output at range. The multi-melter shots that they can bring for the points are pretty staggering, and as a core unit they can make use of all the great character rerolls and things that Sisters have to offer. They get innate ignores cover, they have pretty decent synergy with rhinos, being able to shield them until they get out, and perhaps the single best thing about the unit is that they can take not 1 but 2 Armorium Cherubs, just 5 points each to allow you to double fire weapons of your choice. You can just convert that into flatly more multi-melter shots, which is very nice indeed, or you can field an interesting flexible loadout, maybe 2 multi-melters, 2 heavy flamers, and then double down on the weapon that's going to be the most useful for the target in question. Again, like a lot of Sisters, they are very, very fragile for the points cost, maybe more so than quite a lot of the rest, and again they don't want to be going anywhere near melee. Like a fair few of Sisters units, maybe a bit of a one-hit wonder, but they really can hit devastatingly hard. Next we come to the Sisters Fortification in the Battle Sanctum. An 80 points choice this one. Again, sorry, a slight typo on the slide. You can't take any heavy weapons on this thing, I'm afraid. Like all fortifications in 9th, it really does depend on the board that you're playing on and how liberal you're being with the terrain rules. Rules as written, this thing can't be placed anywhere within 3 inches of other terrain pieces, which might mean on some battlefields there's literally no place that you could legally set this up. If you are playing on a board with something like player-placed terrain though, it could give you a flexible and powerful piece of obscuring cover, guaranteeing that you're going to hide at least some of your army from enemy fire, and it allows one of your cheap characters to sit around generating miracle dice for a lot of the game, which could be really quite powerful for certain armies such as Ebb and Chalice. As well as that, it also gives a minor leadership buff to nearby Sororitas units. In general though, I'm not particularly convinced that this is going to be a good investment. You are basically sacrificing 80 points of your army for something that doesn't do any extra damage or soak up any enemy fire directly. Extra obscuring terrain is pretty handy to have, I guess, but depending on the board you might well have enough of that anyway. Even the miracle dice generation still needs to basically sacrifice a character to sit around doing actions in it, so I'm a bit underconvinced as to the utility of that as well. Overall, I've been a bit generous and scored it a 6 out of 10. On the right boards, I think it could make a difference, but obviously if you're struggling to even place the thing on the board, it can be a bit of a questionable investment, I think. Next up, we'll go through the Sisters Elite's choices, and we'll start out with the Celestian Sacrosants, certainly a competitive staple of a unit. These are the Shield and Mace or Shield and Halberd Sisters. They're 14 points per model, and really quite an interesting unit, with some fairly decent melee damage, and actually fairly sturdy for toughness 3 1-wound models with a 2+ save and a 4+ invul. They don't do as much damage as Repentia in melee, but they can certainly take a punch a lot better, and their bodyguard rule can be pretty handy in competitive Sisters lists. They do allow for some pretty nasty character shenanigans, such as where your opponent can easily see some big units such as Celestine or Morven Val and not be able to target them because the bodyguard rule prevents it. They get inbuilt heroic intervention, which is pretty nice for defending any objectives they might be sat on, can set to defend when they're charged, and if they need a defensive boost, they can use Inviolate Shield Wall for a -1 to wound them, which might well save the squad against certain attacks. I think that these shielded bodyguards are really quite decent indeed. Maybe their main weaknesses are relatively slow movement and having less devastating damage than Repentia, but I certainly think that they're a competitive unit, and I've scored them a 9 out of 10. Comparatively, I think that they outperform the more vanilla Celestians by quite a bit. The standard pattern Celestians are 13 points per model, and are basically the stat line of a regular battle sister, with 1 extra attack, and a nice damage buffing rule which gives them +1 to hit next to a Canoness or a Palatine. It means that if you want to form a core of Battle Sister squads as actual damage dealers, you might well want to look at Celestians as an alternative. They could be a better place for investing for things like special weapons or heavies. Again, they have the bodyguard special rule like the Sacrosants, so could also be used for shenanigans and things, and are a core unit so can get some good buffs, including accessing some things that are aimed at bolters. On the downside, they aren't OBSEC, so if you get onto an objective with an enemy OBSEC unit, they're not going to take it in priority. And they don't fill any of the important troop slots for detachments that generate you command points. I'd say perhaps the biggest weakness and reason they might be overlooked is that they don't really do a lot that regular sisters don't already. And often in 40k armies you want the troops to be your basic battle line, and when you're looking for elites, fast attack or heavy support, you might be looking for units that are going to be dealing significant amounts more damage, packing some seriously heavy firepower. I just feel in a world where things like Sacrosants, Repentia, Dominions and Retributors exist, these goals might not be the first choice for a unit of deadly firepower to buff. Overall, I've scored them a 7 out of 10. I don't really think they're all that far behind, and I think they're still usable, but I think they're usually going to get passed over for other options. Next up, we come to the signature Nundam suits of the latest Sisters release in the Paragon War suits. Again, an elite choice, 3 models, no more, no less, 240 points with the Flamers or the Bolters, or 270 points with the Multi-Melters. Unfortunately, these goals just feel like a unit that has real potential, but perhaps are just too fragile for their own good. They're one of the biggest, meatiest and most threatening core units around, a good place for layering various different buffs, and they're certainly threatening both at range and in melee with their big swords and maces. The main problem though is their durability. They are toughness 5 with a 2+ save and -1 damage, but only having 4 wounds means that anti-tank weapons will still wreck them pretty quickly. In particular, they're just really susceptible to damage from things like the D3+3 damage characteristic that we're seeing quite a lot in 40k right now. Things like Drakari Dark Lances, Admech Cognis Las Cannons, or even just a fair amount of mortal wounds are going to give these suited sisters a bad day. For that reason, I just think that you're usually going to struggle to actually bring their might to bear. They might be able to get a turn or so's firepower, but seeing as they're going to need to be striding towards the enemy to make that melee happen, they're usually going to be exposed to the brunt of enemy firepower, and I feel like they're often just going to get cut down before they really get to achieve their true potential. I certainly feel like the sort of unit that a small points decrease could make very good indeed, but currently as it stands I just can't really rate them too highly. I've scored them a 6 out of 10 here. Maybe that's a little bit on the harsh side. I have a feeling that if they do work and the opponent can't deal with them for whatever reason, they could potentially do lots of damage, but I think they're just going to come up short against too many armies. Next up though, we come to one of the stars of the Sisters Codex, the mighty and sorrowful Repentia, 14 points per model, and some of the most dangerous nutters with eviscerators that you're likely to run into in 40k. They're pretty much the epitome of a glass cannon unit, again incredibly fragile, but monstrously dangerous damage output if they get into combat, and they do have a fair few decent ways to actually deliver them there. You can have them jump out of a rhino, move out of strategic reserve and make a very reliable charge with miracle dice, or even just advance and charge them on the board with a Repentia Superior, and when they get there, a flurry of high strength, high AP, 2 damage attacks, layered with buffs like +1 to wound from the Repentia Superior, maybe the Bloody Rose Stratagem tear them down, and anything else that you'd fancy throwing on them, is usually going to have a good chance of tearing apart whatever they get their chainswords on. Just as an extra incentive, you also get a Fights in Death stratagem, so they're very difficult to take out for your opponent if they can't shoot them, and if they do eventually die, you get a free miracle dice in death as well, to plug back into using for something useful in your army. Obviously their main weakness is that they're likely to die straight away after they get exposed to the enemy. Their 5+ feel no pain does help, but they're still really fragile to enemy fire, though I think at their points cost they're easily able to trade up and drag down far more expensive things to death before they go. I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10, monstrously scary, and are pretty much always something that your opponent needs to be wary of. As we're talking about the Repentia, let's go on to the Repentia Superior, who I wouldn't say is a necessary choice to take along with Repentia, but if you want a buffing character, then for 40 points I think that she's easily the best choice to escort them if you're not taking anyone else. 2 absolutely great buffs to them. Getting to advance and charge will massively increase their threat range, particularly when you can lock in long advances and charges with miracle dice. You could potentially have Repentia squads flying across the board, anything up to 24-inch charges. Alternatively, if you can keep her in range of the squad, maybe piling out of a rhino alongside them, she'll give them a +1 to wound in melee, which would really let them punch up against the toughest foes around, things like tough vehicles and monsters. If you've got a Repentia squad, she's also slotless for detachments and things as well, which is helpful. For herself, she's fairly fragile and low damage, but that doesn't really matter too much in a buffing character, I think. I'd be aware that if the Repentia are coming out of strategic reserves or vehicles, she won't be able to make them advance and charge because of that happening in the command phase. Still though, a great support character for a great combat unit. I've scored her a 9 out of 10. Next, let's look through a few of the Ministorum Battle Conclave units. The Arco-Flagellants are 13 points per model, an elite choice that specialises in pumping out crazy amounts of Strength 4 AP-1 attacks, re-rolling hit rolls with Zealot. These murderous abominations do have a really decent melee damage output, but again maybe aren't quite as general purpose as Repentia, being absolutely spectacular against infantry, but a bit less overwhelming against anything with a really good save or good toughness. They do have a few of their own advantages though, having decent movement at 7 inches, fairly tough with 2 toughness 4 wounds and a 5+ feel no pain, really not bad at all for a 13-point model that, and a pretty excellent 1 command point stratagem that's typically going to be worth an extra 20 attacks out of the unit if you max them out. On the downside, they don't get any order benefits, they're Ministorum not Adepta Sororitas, and as I said, they won't be quite as good against elite infantry or vehicles compared with the Sisters Repentia. Still though, for a unit that's still really threatening in melee, and will actually need some dedicated firepower to chew through them, I score them fairly highly. I've rated them an 8 out of 10. Next up we have the Storm Shield and Power Sword wielding Crusaders, 11 points per model, and interestingly available in really tiny units of just 2 models. While for a more damage dealing purpose I think they're kind of overlooked, I'd not really be quite as bothered by these when you can get the Celestian Sacrosants, who have similar shields, a 2+ armor and far better melee. But their main advantage is just being a really tiny unit, great for holding down objectives on the absolute cheap minimum, and doing actions like retrieve Octarius data for a crazy tiny 22-point investment. I think they're one of the better choices for very small units like this. They're more durable than the average tiny unit like this, with their shield for a 4+ save and having a 3+ base. They even have a little bit of mortal wound protection, and in theory you could use Inviolate Shield Wall if you just wanted to give them every chance to annoyingly survive when they really shouldn't. Their Power Sword might be good for killing a light infantry or two, and you can include them in a detachment slotless if you have a missionary. Generally I'd not be using these for any sort of battle line unit unless you're going for fun and fluffy type things, but they seem really quite great for cheap screening, grunt work, and doing actions, just because of how expendable and throwaway the unit is. I'd say it's a similar sort of story for the Death Cult Assassins as well, 13 points per model and available in units of 2, so can do the exact same role as the Crusaders, just with a bit of a different twist. They only get a 5+ invul, not a 4+, but they're really quite a lot more aggressive than the Crusaders, having a nice 7-inch movement and really quite a decent flurry of melee attacks, 4 attacks hitting on a 2+ with a power sword profile. They do cost a little bit more points and they aren't as durable, but they might have the advantage of actually being able to surprise a minor enemy unit holding an objective, maybe clear out some infantry, and punch up against a real unit when the Crusaders might struggle a bit more. Again, perhaps could be another option for a unit jumping out of a rhino and dealing loads of damage. They'll be fairly decent against infantry, particularly anyone who's relying on a high save to keep them safe, but again with only 1 damage, they're just a bit less general purpose than Repentia. Next up, let's go through some of the Sisters of Battle elite support character choices, and we'll start out with Astrid Thurger and Agatha Durglan. They're a unique character choice, so only 1 slot, and it's 90 points for the pair. Though to be honest, despite having one of the cooler banners out of all the 40k, I think their rules are just a bit underwhelming, at least in their current incarnation. I'd say the main selling point is to give you a single turn where they give an aura buff of all 6 sacred rites for a single turn. It's certainly not nothing, but it just doesn't really feel like it's going to be all that useful. The sacred rites are quite good individually, but I think it's quite rare that one unit is going to make use of more than half of them in a single turn, and only getting that big buff for 1 single turn just means that this model is going to have 1 big flare of usefulness and then be considerably less so. They do have a few other minor selling points though. You get 1 command point refunded for a relic stratagem that you take. They make 1 character fight a bit better in combat. They do pack a small punch in combat themselves. Astrid gets a damage 2 power sword. As characters go, they're relatively sturdy with 9 wounds between the pair of them. But overall, I must admit the amount of buffs that they get is just a bit of a weird mishmash collection. They might amount to being useful enough to have around in the middle of a big Sisters battle line, buffing multiple squads. But if you are going down that route, I feel like the Sisters of Battle have so many cheap support characters that you're almost certainly going to be better with other choices. Overall, I've chosen to rank them a 5 out of 10. I don't think they're entirely useless, but just not particularly good buffs for the points, and they're outcompeted by a whole ton of cheap Sisters support characters. Perhaps on a much better note is the Dialogus, a 50-point elite choice character who can intone one of the new hymns of battle and has a relic that you can buy in for 1 command point to allow her to chant 2. They're pretty decent buffs, though maybe a little bit unreliable to go off. They will only go off on a 3+, but can give the Sisters better shooting nearby or +1 attack with War Hymn. In addition, she gives +1 leadership and allows any nearby Sisters to make slightly better use of miracle dice, adding 1 to the value. And I think for a 50-point character, she's really quite a good support one, and decent value for the points. I think perhaps the biggest weakness though is comparison to the Dogmata, who does cost a few points more, but I think that she brings a lot of extra value. If all you want though is the cheap war hymns, then for 50 points she's a great choice. I've chosen to rank her 8 out of 10. Speaking of which, we come to the Dogmata now. 65 points for this particular priest, and basically grants the same sort of war hymn boost as the Dialogus. I think the Dogmata probably provides the better support powers though, granting Obsec to a nearby core unit. Could be great on things like Celestian Sacrosants to help them hold objectives, particularly good with their heroic intervention and toughness, and could allow regular Sisters to hold the line, still shooting while doing actions. On top of that though, she actually comes with a pretty potent melee weapon as well, a few attacks with decent strength, AP and damage. Could be good for killing a Space Marine or 2 once battle is joined. I think the melee and the Obsec buff in particular probably makes her worth the extra points over the Dialogus, though I must admit there's benefits and trade-offs to either. I've ranked the Dogmata 9 out of 10. As Sister support characters go, I think she's very good. Next we come up to the Hospitaller, another 50-point support character, and kind of the Sister's medic or version of the Apothecary. In a similar vein, she gets the Feel No Pain aura, giving the nearby infantry a 6+ to shrug off taken wounds. She can heal injured models for D3 wounds per turn, though perhaps the single most interesting thing is that you can pay 1 command point to allow her to heal D3 models into a unit. I'd say this last bit might well be the main reason to bring her in-game. It can really punish your opponent for not quite dealing with depleted units. Say for example if you have a Retributor squad that's taken a couple of multi-melter casualties, it's going to be incredibly painful to have her just set them back up onto the board and give them another turn's worth of firepower. Maybe a little bit situational. I think in some games her defensive and durability buffs aren't going to be worth all that much, but just for the potential of regenerating powerful models to the board, I think she's certainly worth a consideration. I've ranked her 8 out of 10. Next we have the Imagifier, yet again a 50-point support character. She's the one who gets to pick which tail to incant before the game, the good ones being rerolls to advance and charge rolls or a +1 strength buff. She can have a relic similar to the priest that allow her to use both at once, which does seem really quite nice in combination with certain units, say Repentia, Sacrosancts, or even those new Sisters Novitiate, more reliable combat and heftier punching when you get there. On the downsides, I'd say that the Tail of the Stoic is really underwhelming now. Only affecting strength 3 attacks or worse means that it's going to be completely redundant against most enemy firepower. I guess could be handy situationally if you are facing, say, a million lasguns. Otherwise, I think that the army that you're going to need to field to want to justify an Imagifier is maybe not the most typical Sisters army. You really need to be going with a bit of a central melee push, and while some armies might really quite like that, others maybe not so much. I don't think she's a bad support character. I've chosen to rank her an 8 out of 10, but she does certainly face stiff competition from the others as well. Say for example, if you're supporting Repentia, I suspect that most people are going to want a Repentia Superior as opposed to an Imagifier. Finally, for the Elite's choices, we come to the Preacher, a really cheap and cheerful support character that I think is well worth a look just because of how few points you have to invest to get him. He's basically there just to make one squad per turn a bit more dangerous in melee, a cheap +1 attack buff that goes off on a 3+ with Warhammer, and if you're taking one along, I'd be very tempted indeed to upgrade to a Zealot's Vindictor, the fun Eviscerator and Heavy Flamer combo that for some reason only costs 5 points for a really potent weapon. Like the other priests, he can be quite fun to have around as he allows the cheaper version of the Holy Rage strat, allowing the units to reroll hit rolls with Zealots, and otherwise could just be a nuisance model to have on the board, one that might soak up a little bit more firepower than you expect with his 4+ invul. Obviously he's not really going to change the world for the very cheap points that he costs. Even the one buff that he does is prone to failure 1 out of every 3 times unless you invest the command points in it. But still, for a fun little throwaway character, I think you could certainly do worse. I've chosen to rank him an 8 out of 10. Finally, last but not least, we get into the HQ choices. I will start out with the archetypical one, the Sisters Canoness. She's 50 points base, and has really quite a lot of decent options for various bits of war gear. She can take Null Rods, Condemner Bolt Guns, Braziers of Holy Fire, and can actually be tooled up into a significantly fighty character if you have the right combo of Warlord traits and relics. For example, there's that Order of Armated Lady build that can do on average 10 or more mortal wounds. I did make a video all about that combo if you want to give it a search. Otherwise though, just being a 50-point character for some cheap reroll ones to hit is going to make the units nearby do better. She's at least reasonably sturdy to take out with a Rosarius and 5 wounds, though of course if she does go pitching herself into melee against any sort of decent opponent, that's probably not going to save her. I think Canonesses are a really good general purpose HQ choice though. Most Sisters of Battle armies I think will field them, and I've chosen to rank them a 9 out of 10. For her sister in arms we have the Palatine, the 45-point Sisters Lieutenant equivalent model, armed with a power sword and bolt pistol or plasma pistol if you want. I think that she's the one that you want to go for if you just want cheap rerolls and cheap buffing efficiency, as she does basically provide the same damage boost for 5 points less, with a small added bonus that your rerolls 1 to wound will work on any flamer weapons, whereas the Canoness's reroll 1s to hit won't have any impact. Generally though, if you are thinking about advancing her into the midfield, I would be a bit more tempted to upgrade to the Canoness. 5 points for the extra wound and attack aren't really all that bad, and make her a far better place for putting things like fighty relics and warlord traits. The Palatine just doesn't seem quite as good for that role. Overall, I think she's maybe a little bit more niche than the Canoness, but will be the superior choice in some niche situations where literally all you want is the buff. I've chosen to rank her an 8 out of 10. For the last of the generic HQs, we come to the Missionary now, an Adeptus Ministorum model for 40 points per model. His choice of war hymns are a bit more flexible than the Preacher's one, though he still doesn't get access to the full list like the Dialogus and the Dogmata do. Otherwise, he gives a small leadership buff. He is the cheapest Sisters of Battle HQ if you do need one just literally to fill a detachment slot, and he is pretty handy to have around with the other Ecclesiarchy Battle Conclave units, as he allows things like Preachers and the various Conclave units to be taken slotless. Generally though, compared with this guy, I do prefer the Preacher. He's cheap and cheerful and can do war hymn just as well, which is probably my favourite hymn of battle out of the first 4. and compared with the actual Sisters of Battle HQ choices, he doesn't really have anywhere near as many synergies or options. I think he's always going to feel a bit underwhelming in terms of actual fighting and durability. Again, not really terrible, quite nice for a bit of force organisation benefits, but maybe a bit lower value than the Preacher and the Sisters HQs, I feel. Moving on to the special characters now, and we start out with the fabulous Triumph of St. Catherine, the slightly mad coffin-bearing centrepiece that will cost you 220 points in-game, and it's one of the weirder datasheets in all of Warhammer 40k, being an absolutely massive model, having a ton of wounds, but also getting character protection and a bunch of other defensive buffs such as -1 to hit and wound, and still getting the infantry keyword. The Triumph just had a whole bunch of different random advantages for a Sisters army. I think it generally wants to be slogging its way towards the centre of the board and forcing the opponent to have to deal with it, and having the rest of your units fight around it and getting its minor buffs. Perhaps one of the nicest benefits is just giving you an extra miracle dice each turn. There aren't as many rules that do that in the new decks. It allows nearby units to manipulate them, gives you an auto-pass morale aura, and gives you +1 to hit in melee for units nearby. Maybe the biggest disadvantages are that it's slightly unwieldy to get round terrain with that enormous base, even if you can technically move through it. When it does catch things in melee, its damage output is okay, though not particularly standout, certainly not for 220 points, and if it does take damage, it will gradually lose relics until it's not being anywhere near as good of a support piece. Overall, I've chosen to score it an 8 out of 10. It's certainly by no means an auto-include, but I think it's usually a model that is going to give your opponent a headache of how to deal with it. They won't be able to target it directly for a while, and once they can, it's going to be kind of annoyingly tough to take out, and will generally work to make the whole core of the army a bit more efficient. Maybe its main weakness is being compared to the other big hitter Sisters characters, things like Morven Val or Celestine. I've chosen to rank it an 8 out of 10 overall. Talking of which though, we come to the High Abbess herself, and Morven Val does certainly sit pretty close to auto-include territory for some of the more competitive Sisters of Battle lists. She's a very points-intensive model at 265 points, but just provides value in all sorts of different areas, and I think it's value that you should be able to make good use of throughout the course of the game. She grants 4 rerolls to hit and wound for a core unit or herself, potentially quite nearly doubling the damage output of any one unit, and even for the other units nearby, they still get rerolls 1 to hit and wound. She herself has very good melee with a damage 3 sword. With her Warlord trait, she should be able to reroll all hits and wounds in combat as well, and once per game, if you haven't quite killed whatever you were in combat with, you can activate Rage Mode and fight twice, which should give you a very decent chance of killing most normal units in a single round of combat. She has solid range damage too, with a decent relic heavy bolter, plus a couple of cracked missiles hitting on 2s. It means she can still contribute damage while she's buffing things, and when she is exposed to enemy firepower, she's at least decently tougher than you might expect, halving incoming damage, a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, and getting character protection in the first place, where she can combo very nicely with the Celestian Sacrosancts. Perhaps the only major weaknesses are that having the vehicle keyword herself, she can't get certain buffs, and it might not help her if she's trying to get into combat and struggling to get around things like ruins that she can't move through. In any case though, I think that she might be one of the most competitive Sisters units at the moment, really going to be a wrong choice to have in the centre of the army. I've ranked her a full 10 out of 10. Next up we come to the Canoness Superior Junitha Rita. She's an HQ choice for 130 points, and soars to battle on top of this horror pulpit in the shape of a giant eagle. She's significantly costlier than other Canonesses, but does get a fair few decent benefits from that, being a bit tougher than the standard Canoness, better rerolls with sort of like a Chapter Master effect where she gives 4 rerolls to hit for 1 unit, and it's quite nice to have in the centre of a durable battle line, giving nearby units light cover if they're within 6 inches. On top of that, she's pretty fast with a 10-inch movement, and she's quite a nice counter-attack piece, those Twin Flamers putting in good work with their Strength 6 damage output, and some reasonable melee with a damage 2 combat weapon. Perhaps the biggest weakness against her being fielded is being locked to the Order of Our Martyr Lady, so if you're not playing that order, in general you're not fielding her. She is much more expensive for a Canoness as well, who can also be fairly threatening with the right combo of Warlord traits and relics, and if there were any other specific Warlord traits and relics that you wanted for her, of course you don't really get any flexibility, as she can't take her own choice, she has to take the one that she's given. Still though, a solid enough HQ choice if you are playing Order of Our Martyred Lady. I've ranked her an 8 out of 10 for effectiveness. Next up we have the Demonifuge, Ephrael Stern and Kaiganil, one of the newest additions to the Sisters of Battle Codex, and it's 120 points for the pair of beatstick characters. For your investment, they do have some pretty solid melee. Ephrael, it gets to ignore invols with her damage 2 power sword, and Cardinal puts out a flurry of attacks to help deal with light infantry. They can deep strike if you need them to, and as characters go they are fairly tough. They're -1 to hit and wound, and they have 11 wounds between the pair of them. They're fairly fast, so quite good at catching their prey with an 8-inch movement. Nephrael has her Bolts of Holy Judgment special rule, which allows her to kind of do a smite but not smite, usually good for a few mortal wounds each turn. I guess their main weakness is they don't have any buffing abilities, so it won't help out the rest of the Sisters' army. For melee characters they might still really struggle with hard targets. Damage 2 is okay and should do decent work against medium infantry, but won't really cut through vehicles and monsters too fast. And for the puritanical Imperial Sisters among you, allowing filthy Xenos into the army might be a bit of a no-no. In any case though, for a fairly cheap beatstick character, I don't really think they're too bad for 120 points. I've chosen to rank them an 8 out of 10. I think perhaps you might not want to take both these guys and Celestine could be argued to do a fairly similar thing but a bit better. Finally, speaking of which, we come to St. Celestine herself, an HQ choice for 200 points and comes with her Gemini Superior. She's very fast with her jump pack, hits pretty hard in melee with a whole bunch of power sword attacks at damage 2, a chance for a few mortal wounds, and the Gemini to back her up and help out a bit against lighter infantry. Perhaps the most fun thing about Celestine is that she's just truly annoying to kill. To start up, she has character protection and can potentially chain out to be near some Celestian sacrosancts, so you're rarely going to be able to target her at range if she sticks near to them. If the Gemini die, she has the potential to resurrect them. When she dies the first time, she comes back on a 2+ with 4 wounds, and the unit gets an innate 4+ invul, and Celestine gets -1 damage. Generally you're going to need some pretty focused firepower with Celestine on her own and unshielded, and then you're likely to have to follow that up by doing it all over again. In addition, Indomitable Belief is quite a good warlord trait with the extra buff to saving throws, and she gives out a fun 6+ invul save aura, which can be pretty good for some Imperial units, say Arcoflagellants for example. In terms of weaknesses, perhaps some of the biggest problems are having multiple characters in the same squad, which could potentially lead you to bleed assassinate points if the opponent does actually manage to kill her. And again, similar to quite a few Sisters units, she might struggle against truly hard targets in melee, particularly anything like Dreadnoughts with a -1 damage or anything toughness 8. Still though, if she can just swoop around picking off medium infantry threats, then she's going to be really good for the points cost. I've chosen to rank her a 9 out of 10, certainly a really threatening Sisters character, and again is likely to cause the opponent headaches if they do want to try and bring down the unit. So that just about brings us to the end of our tour through the Sisters of Battle Codex. Hope at least some of the discussion's been useful to you, and if you have any further insights on any of the units, or you think I've ranked any too high or too low, let me know down in the comments as always. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like it, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular videos coming, including hopefully a bit more for the Sisters of Battle now and then. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, particularly big high effort ones like this, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which is how I can afford to spend all the time making big long videos like this that take hours and days to make. If you have been enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. You can find the channel Patreon link down in the video description, and I do try and offer some good rewards for channel backers. Supporters get to see new videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the channel's regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help out, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.